Let me, without further ado, introduce you to Ms. Thandi Smith. He has worked with the Media Monitoring Africa for about 9 years now, and was recently appointed as the head of programs for the organization. She previously headed the policy and quality program. So this is a good topic so that you get to know what other policies exist in South Africa that deals with misinformation and disinformation during the elections in particular. And therefore, this what you call a policy and quality program that's used to head focused on a range of issues, including media policy, regulations, digital rights, internet governance, and quality journalism. So she's been around the block. Now, she holds a master's degree in media studies obtained from the University of Witwatersrand. So she's an alumni like myself of VETS, and her dissertation examined issues of universal access in South Africa's digital migration. She also obtained an honors degree in media studies from the same institution. And Thandi has a keen interest in research around new media, internet governance, and media law. So do pick her brains on these matters. So without further ado, Thandi, I hand over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Hopewell, and good morning to everyone attending. I'm really excited to be discussing this topic this morning. It's something that's definitely close to my, definitely a passion of mine, and most of you know, or many of you know that MMA has been doing a lot of work in this area. So I'm very excited to be sharing with you this morning. I'm just wanting to make sure my sharing screen is working. You should be seeing the PowerPoint presentation. If not, please let me know. So yes, my job this morning is relatively easy. I'm taking the opportunity to sort of set the context, to give a bit of an introduction and overview of where we find ourselves in the midst of dis and misinformation, particularly in relation to our elections and the suddenly election period that we find ourselves in. So I will be talking a bit about how we define disinformation, how disinformation is defined during elections, the role of the media around elections, but specifically how to then grapple with and combat disinformation during elections. I'm joined by two brilliant fellow panelists who will be, I think, taking us through some far more practical and interactive sessions. And then, yeah, as Hopewell mentioned, we will be having some Q&A after the presentations, which I hope will also be quite interactive, and we can have a bit of a discussion about these issues. So yeah, please keep any questions or comments that you might have for that session. So yes, let's get started. Like I said, I do recognize many of the names in the attendees, but for those of you who are not so familiar with Media Monitoring Africa, we are a non-profit organization established in 1993 in the lead up to our first democratic elections. And the purpose of the project at the time was specifically to monitor media's coverage of the elections. And since then, we have grown into a small medium organization, and our vision is a just and fair society empowered by free, responsible, and quality media. We aim to promote the development of media that is transparent, diverse, ethical, and accountable to its audiences, the critical and constructive communications by the powerful, and most importantly, an informed and engaged and connected citizenry. Now, this speaks specifically to the role of the media during an election period, and also why we are so involved in combating disinformation, because with the overwhelming amount of disinformation that we do see, we will struggle to achieve an informed, engaged, and connected citizenry. Just on sort of what we will be looking at in terms of the presentation, a quick look at media, elections, and disinformation, going into how we define disinformation. Since the sort of, we could say, rise of the concept of disinformation, there have been a number of different attempts to define disinformation, to grapple with understanding what disinformation actually is. We'll look at a bit of different forms, a few different forms of false content, and then we'll go into a bit of definitions around what our Electoral Act actually says about false and misleading information during an election period. I think that's critical for a session like this. And then a bit of discussion around what we can actually expect in the next few months in relation to disinformation and our local government elections, what we can be looking out for. And these are very much based on sort of lessons learned from 2019 elections. Quick look at methods to combat disinformation, and most importantly, the importance of the role of a credible media during an election period. It's a lot to cover. So yeah, let's see how we go. So one of the most important things I think to consider during the specific period is that an election period is generally, well, it's generally known to already be a period of heightened tension. We're already dealing with potential violence. We're already dealing with, or given the current context that we're in, coming, through the COVID-19 pandemic, I think those heightened tensions are exacerbated by the context that we already find ourselves in. We often speak about public trust in institutions, and we continue to see an environment where trust in institutions, including the media, continues to be critically low. And this is something that is, improved trust or increased trust in the media and in our public institutions is absolutely critical for that environment of a connected and engaged citizenry. But we also know that we are dealing with an environment where we often see active agents who are at play to discredit the media, which poses even more challenges around public trust and public trust in our institutions and the credibility of independent media. So this does raise two important questions that we sort of want to grapple with and think about over the next while that we in the session, and that's, how do we actually deal with disinformation? We know that it's not going anywhere. We know that disinformation is not a new phenomenon. We know that it's existed since the dawn of sharing information. But we also know that we do need to deal with disinformation, and it has over the last few years become exponentially more dangerous because of a number of different reasons. And the second question that I want to sort of grapple with is, how do we work with media, so with yourselves as journalists and the media industry, to improve credibility during an election period? So those are sort of the two questions to keep at the forefront while we go through these issues. So if we just take a moment to sort of look at the context that we find ourselves in the lead up to our elections, and in light of the fact that we're dealing with disinformation, and I want to specifically look at disinformation as a sort of form of conflict during an election period. So I think it's absolutely important that we take note of the fact that democratic institutions, including our media and civil society, need to de-escalate violence if it is not seen to proactively, or if these institutions are not seen to proactively be de-escalating violence, it will simply be seen as aiding this potential conflict. So I think the overarching responsibility is that we all have a role to play in de-escalating potential violence. When we talk about potential violence in this context, we are talking about the fact that violence and conflict can take on different forms, including online disinformation. We specifically say, that online disinformation is another form of conflict or violence because of the very real offline, real world harm that disinformation can incite, where it starts online, but it has it can have real physical effects. As I mentioned, we have seen how online disinformation can lead to offline violence. The other complexity around disinformation is that although we try and define disinformation, although we try and there have been really good concepts developed around understanding disinformation, what we have seen through our experience over the last few years is that disinformation is often mixed with other digital harms, including hate speech, harassment, and incitement of violence. So that makes it very difficult to have one solution to tackle disinformation as one problem. It's often mixed with elements of other digital harms, and that makes it difficult to differentiate and to then take action or tackle one element at a time. And we'll go into some of these methods shortly. But I think just it's key to understand that disinformation is then often mixed with those other elements, including xenophobic content, including racist content as well. So again, how do we proactively take action against disinformation online? But more importantly, how do we combat this during an election period? So I want to look at a few different definitions of disinformation, and I'll take you through some of them. You'll also notice that I won't mention, or I won't speak about or refer to the concept of fake news. We do stay away from using the term fake news, and that's because of the I think now broadly understood or broad understanding of the fact that if it's news, it can't be fake. And if it is fake, then it's not considered news. So we do stay away from the concept of fake news. We speak about mis and disinformation. So when looking at disinformation, particularly, we speak about false, inaccurate, or misleading information designed, presented, and promoted to intentionally cause public harm or for profit. And the intention is what is key when understanding disinformation. And this is also why it makes it so very, very difficult to simply define something as, yes, that is disinformation, or no, that is not, because it's understanding the intention behind the misleading content. So then we go on to say, well, we talk about during an election period. So when we talk about causing public harm, during an election period, we refer to the fact that harm in this regard includes, but is not limited to, disrupting or preventing an election, creating hostility or fear in order to influence the conduct or outcome of an election, or unduly influencing the outcome or conduct of an election. When we look at sort of further unpacking definitions of disinformation, we turn to UNESCO, who has done quite a lot of research and work in this area. and has published widely reports and research about disinformation and disinformation during elections. But I wanted to look at this sort of defining clause around disinformation. But it says, in general, the term disinformation is preferred for regulatory purposes because of two key elements that narrow the scope. It requires intention and therefore takes into account that people may inadvertently share false information without any untoward intention. And secondly, the required intention is targeted, for example, to cause harm or for profit, which both narrows the scope and seeks to address the negative consequences that can arise. And this is why it is so important to define disinformation separately to misinformation, simply because of the fact that it is easy to share false information, and often sharing false information unknowingly or by mistake, or you come across a piece of content, and we've seen this play out time and time again with the COVID pandemic, where you might receive a piece of content on WhatsApp or social media, and it is in fact false, and it wasn't initially designed to create public harm, but you get the message or the piece of content on a WhatsApp, and you think that it is true, and you share that on to friends and family, and your intention was that it may help, or that it may assist, without knowing that it was false content. That is not considered disinformation. The original post or the original context of sharing that content may be disinformation. So that's why we do talk about how complex this can be. This graphic from First Draft News is a great little image that shows the definitions of misinformation, disinformation, and another concept of malinformation. But you can see the types of information that fall under disinformation is the false context, imposter content, manipulated content, fabricated content. All of those speak to the intention of deliberately sharing false information to cause harm. Misinformation can be a false connection, misleading content. And often we find that journalists and media can be guilty of sharing misinformation when content gets published that turns out to be false content, or turns out to not be entirely accurate. That is considered misinformation. But it's what you do with that information. It's how you rectify that sharing of that information. I'm just keeping an eye on time. Okay. So I wanted to delve into, again, using the UNESCO Journalism, Fake News and Disinformation Handbook. I wanted to delve into the types of content that often come about when understanding or trying to grapple with the concept of false information. So we see a couple of different categories of false information that often circulates. Here we see false connection, misleading content, and false context. So these seem to be quite, at face value, quite straightforward. But it's the small kind of detail that often manipulates or misleads people and can be so easy that people don't necessarily engage with. So false connections, we often see this on social media, where headlines, the visuals or captions don't support the content. This is typically just your clickbait content, where there's a very enticing headline, but then you click on the headline and the content doesn't match the headline. Something as simple as that. Misleading content where there's misleading use of information to frame issues or individuals in certain ways. And this can be done as easily as cropping photographs or choosing quotes or statistics selectively. Now, this again, it's so difficult, or it can be difficult to differentiate, because it's about the intention. Yes, we choose quotes. Everyone is selective. I think, we can't talk about completely outright objective information when it comes to journalism and media and reporting. It's the information presented, but it's about what you do with that information, how you present that information, and your intention around sharing that information. But when it's done with the intention to cause harm, that's when it becomes false information and borderline disinformation. We look at false context, and this again, we saw this play out in the July in the failed insurrection, the unrest that we saw, the protests in July, where legitimate content, so real images, real photos, real stories were shared, but using the false context. So images of particular groups of people protesting that did happen, but happened a year ago, was not relevant to what was happening in July. This we see very often on social media. Then looking at just a few more examples of false content, we look at imposter content, manipulated content, and fabricated content. Imposter content, this I remember a few years ago, if we go back sort of 3-4 years ago, we saw a lot of this cropping up, particularly with our own journalists and our own websites. I'm sure many of you were victims of this kind of imposter content. So journalists have their bylines used, or organizations' logos used in videos or images that did not create. This also speaks to the false, or you could say false, or what's the word I'm looking for? The copied websites where you've got people trying to share disinformation, but using credible media's logos, credible media's URLs, and so forth to publish this content. I think some of the classic ones were, if we go back, there was a site that was Times Live, but the I in Times was a 1, and it was a very dodgy website. But because it at face value looked like it could be credible because of using the images related to Times Media, that's how they often got people to click. And we still see this today. Videos that get shared on YouTube often have, credible. I think a common one is BBC, where videos get shared and people assume it's from BBC because it's got the logos, but it's in actual fact not. We look at manipulated content and fabricated content as well, which speaks to the same kind of issues. This is just a nice graphic of a sort of quick process around how easy it is to push through disinforming and push through a disinformation strategy. I know that Jean Leroux, who's going to follow after me, is going to speak to specifically identifying mis and disinformation on social media. But this kind of graphic just shows how easy it is to really undermine the outcome of these disinformation strategies is then undermining democracy, and how dangerous this is and how easy it is to create content that actually does this. It also speaks to how we often see disinformation strategies really taking a dehumanizing approach that often, includes the harassment of the target of disinformation through online violence, through trolls and troll networks, and really undermining credibility. We often see this play out when journalists are targeted as well. I think that we can't speak about these issues without recognizing the very real harassment that journalists and often female journalists withstand and undergo on when being the target of disinformation. And we've seen a number of our very own journalists be victims to this. So I then want to take a few minutes to look at what we know about managing false information during an election period. So our Electoral Act speaks about intentional false statements. Now, we know that when looking at these definitions or looking at these sort of regulations around this information, or the sharing of false information, this is only applicable during an election period, and it's applicable to political parties, to politicians. But the point is that it does mention false statements, intentional sharing of false statements and false information. So we see that Section 89(2) of our Electoral Act says that no person may publish any false information with the intention of disrupting or preventing an election, creating hostility or fear in order to influence the conduct or outcome of an election, or influencing the outcome or conduct of election. I did mention some of these elements earlier on when talking about the disinformation and what we mean by harm. So here we already see the concept of how disinformation can play out in creating a space where elections are in fact not free, not fair, and not credible when disinformation plays a part. We go further into looking at our local government, Municipal Electoral Act, that also speaks to false, intentional false statements. And here we see that it refers to the fact that no person, when recommend, knowing that it is false, without believing on reasonable grounds that the statement is true, no person may publish false information with the intention of, again, disrupting or preventing election, creating hostility or fear in order to influence the conduct and so forth. So it is important to know that during this heightened time of tension and during the specific election period, that there are provisions in place to prevent the intentional sharing of false statements. But again, this applies to those that are campaigning, that are the political parties and so forth during an election period. So I know I've got only a few minutes left, but I wanted to now touch on a few things that we know to expect. I think going into this election period, we are in a more fortunate position, if you could call it that, because we have had experience with disinformation. We know what impact disinformation can have, and we know to prepare for the potential disinformation during this period. We know that we can expect a number of strategic disinformation campaigns, whether it's coming from, the general public, whether it's coming from, politically aligned individuals. We know that we need to be on the lookout for what could constitute a disinformation campaign. We know that already, because we're moving into a time of heightened tension, when you have journalists and media, when you yourselves are holding those accountable, are putting that pressure on politicians and on political parties, there's bound to be the backlash of harassment of journalists. I know that us as MMA, organizations like ourselves, like SANEF, are offering some tools and some ways to mitigate the harassment, but I think the very sad reality is that it is there. And again, like I said, the very gendered harassment of journalists is something that we need to deal with, and combat and take action against. We know that we are going to see messaging that will deliberately attempt to cause doubt and mistrust in our election processes. We saw this in 2019. We've seen this in many different election periods and processes across the world when it comes to disinformation. But what we know, what will happen, what we know is that there will be strategies that will confuse members of the public around voting day, around the processes, around the management. And what this does is it causes mistrust in public institutions. So where we need to rely on institutions like the IEC, when that doubt or mistrust is sort of imposed on members of the public, that little bit of mistrust in the IEC will have a detrimental impact to voter turnout, to people being informed about how to make a decision when it comes to voting day. And that, so this kind of content has very real implications on people's voting behavior. We know that from examples of disinformation from 2019, we're going to be talking, my colleague Azola is going to be talking about our platform, or the platform Real 411. So I won't get too much into that, but in this election period, we saw the kind of disinformation being reported through the system. But it was bizarre. It was, there was actual content circulating, claiming that if you want to vote for specific parties, you need to turn up on different days to vote for those different parties. We saw the morning of voting day, or the evening before, we saw an influx of content around how the address of, or the voting station locations have changed, which if you sort of a member of the public who's on the fence on voting, if you suddenly get confused about where you need to go, how you need to do it, you're more than likely going to rather just not put in the effort, even when the content is just absolutely false. It's completely fabricated. And also changing rules for voting eligibility. We saw this happen in 2019. And again, it's that causing that mistrust and causing that those elements of doubt, which have a detrimental impact on voter turnout, which in turn has an impact on the credibility and the running of free and fair elections. So what can we do about this? It's very easy to get sucked into the very real doom and gloom of disinformation, but what we have seen is brilliant collaborations between organizations, our key institutions taking action and actually doing something to combat disinformation. So I think it is important to go back and take note of the fact that disinformation is a complex issue, and there's no one simple solution to solving disinformation. One of the most important methods that we know works to counter disinformation is to publish counter narratives to the disinformation being shared. But that will also only work if people have trust in the sources of information. So it's important that media yourselves work on building that public trust with audiences. So when that counter narrative or those counter narratives combating disinformation are shared and do circulate in media narratives, that people are able to rely on that information, and they know that they can rely on that information. We know that fact-checking does form a very integral part of combating disinformation, and it goes hand in hand with counter-narratives. We need to make sure that we do have solutions, or that we are finding these solutions that are in the public interest. I think that that's also one of the critical challenges that we face, that it's not up to government to solve disinformation. It's not up to only the tech platforms to solve disinformation. It's not up to one stakeholder to combat these challenges, that it's a collective issue with collaborations that work, and that work in the public interest to take on these challenges. And for us, we have seen that independent reporting systems like Real 411 do work. It enables counter narratives to be produced. It enables the sort of more, it's in addition to methods like fact checking that create an awareness around these disinformation campaigns, around these issues of credibility. So in conclusion, I want to just touch on, or take a few seconds to just touch on some of these thoughts to leave you with as we go into the next presentations. Is that we're not dealing with these issues in isolation. These challenges are not unique to South Africa and unique to our own context, that these issues are very global in nature, that the trust in public institutions, including trust in media, is something that is being experienced worldwide and continue to be a challenge. I think it's critical that we move into this period understanding where we're coming from, that media, that journalists, that you in the media industry are facing unprecedented challenges, coming from, or still being, or needing to report with in the COVID-19 pandemic, and dealing with a very short election period. It's critical that media are at the forefront of reporting on public interest issues. And I think just to reiterate the importance of independent media and media freedom, that is absolutely critical for free and fair elections. And we need to work towards this by building media credibility, by improving media's quality and coverage in an election period, promoting digital literacy, and combating disinformation. And with that, I think my time is up as well. So Hopewell, over to you. I know that we will be taking questions and comments at the end.
Thank you so much, my lady. I hope everybody got some food for thoughts there. And also there's been, sorry about that, my glitch is here. And also there's been quite interesting definitions that you challenge us with, noting that there are slight differences between disinformation and misinformation, and how technically and in terms of regulation they are applicable.